Hello everyone and welcome to the webinar, Why Gender and Land Matter in Rural Ghana and Around the World. This webinar is presented jointly by the SIL Gender Impacts team and a USAID Feed the Future initiative to promote soybean production and utilization in sub-Saharan Africa, as well as Catholic Relief Services of Ghana. My name is Ashley Negley and I'm a program specialist for the Soybean Innovation Lab. Before we begin, I would like to give everyone a quick overview of the GoToWebinar software, which you can use to engage with other panelists, ask questions, and access webinar resources. On your GoToWebinar control panel, you will see a questions pane. Please type in your questions throughout the webinar, and we will address as many as possible we will collect as many as possible and try to address them in the question and answer session at the end. Questions that are not answered during the webinar will receive a written response after the webinar has concluded. Also, there is a handouts pane in your GoToWebinar control panel. Open this tab to access the webinar agenda, the webinar presentation slides, and additional reading materials related to the topic of gender and land tenure. I will now turn it over to Dr. Kathleen Ragsdale, who will introduce the panelists and give you a brief overview of the webinar.
Hey, thank you everyone. We're really glad to have you here today, and we want to thank the United States Agency for International Development, Feed the Future, and the Soybean Innovation Lab for your support that made this webinar possible. So we're going to be talking today about why gender and land matter in rural Ghana and the world, and the importance of closing the gender gap in agricultural development. We'd like to have your help making this webinar as interactive as possible and hope you'll be able to participate in all three polls. And before we get started, we also want to mention that our presenters are in 3 different countries and our 226 registrants are in 39 countries, which we are delighted about. And so connectivity and slide transitions can be an issue, so please bear with us. And also, please feel free to stop viewing our webcams if you would like, if that might help with your connectivity issues. So to get us started today, I want to introduce our presenters. I'm Kathleen, and I lead the Gender Impacts team of the Feed the Future Soybean Innovation Lab, or SIL. And I'm a research professor at the Social Science Research Center of Mississippi State University. Gina is a research scientist with the SIL Gender Impacts team and is with Democracy International's Columbia office. Mary co-leads the SIL Gender Impacts team and is an assistant research professor at the Social Science Research Center of Mississippi State University. And Mawuli is the agricultural program manager of Catholic Relief Services of Ghana, which is a host country implementing partner with the Soybean Innovation Lab. So our gender impacts work is focused on empowering men and women smallholder farmers to increase household nutrition and household income through soybean, which is both a cash crop and a nutritious food crop. We work to evaluate the Soybean Innovation Lab's larger goal to bring productivity among women soybean farmers on par with men to feed the world's growing population. In fact, USAID, the United States Agency for International Development, holds it by empowering women farmers with the same access to land, new technologies, and capital as men. We can increase crop yields by as much as 30%. And this is increasingly as important as we know that the global population is estimated to reach 10 billion by 2050. So to get started today, I want to share with you the brief outline of what we'll be covering. So we'll have a brief overview of land rights and tenure systems, and then we're going to be talking about land tenure and customary systems and access and control of land. Next, we're going to be talking about the gender equity and land tenure research in Ghana's northern region. We also call that GELT, so gender equity and land tenure, and factors that impact access and control in Ghana's northern region, which really for us kind of coalesced around cultures and tradition. And under that, we have categories of seniority and social status, birth connections and marital connections, and marital status. And then we're going to be wrapping up and going back to look at gender gaps in agricultural productivity and agricultural development. We will discuss some specific factors that affect land tenure, and we'll consider how these factors can have different implications for men and women. And we'll draw on our research in northern Ghana as we cover each topic in order to give you some specific examples. And then we'll close by looking at how gender inequality in land tenure can affect agricultural productivity. And now I'm going to turn it over to Ashley to ask you to participate in our first quick poll.
Thanks, Kathleen. We'd like to ask you to take this quick pre-test. I'll be launching 3 separate polls that will allow you to submit your answers into the question. So I've launched the first poll. Access to land and control over land mean the same thing, true or false? I will be closing the poll in 3, 2, 1. Great job, guys. Looks like 98% of you have reported that as false. I will now be launching the second poll. Control over land is defined as the ability to make decisions in regards to land. True or false? I will be closing the poll in 3, 2, 1. Looks like 89% of you reported that as true. On to our last poll question. Control over land includes the ability to transfer land titles. True or false? I'll be closing the poll in 3, 2, 1. Looks like 92% of you reported that as true. Thanks everyone for submitting your poll results. I will now be turning it back over to Gina to continue the presentation.
Thank you, Ashley, and hello everyone. I will begin by talking about what rights to land means in the literature, and it includes how rights to land are allocated or distributed, how boundaries to plots of land are set, how land can be transferred from one party to another, whether through sale, lease, loan, gift, or inheritance, and how resolutions are reached when rights to land are disputed. Ashley?
I'm with you. I've closed the poll, but it looks like it's stuck on the screen.
Okay, I'll give you a minute. Thanks everyone for your patience. Ah, there you go. Thank you, Ashley.
Looking right? Good.
Yes, thank you. So I was talking about what rights to land mean in the literature. So we were talking about allocation, delimitation, transfer, and adjudication to land. Now, in order to talk about increasing tenure security, UN Habitat has developed a model that suggests there is a continuum of land rights. Under this model, it is assumed that there must be a process of formalization to achieve tenure security, and the last stage of this process of formalization is the individualized rights. So here we're going to categorize land tenure system based on who holds the control over the land. Considering this approach, land tenure systems roughly fall under 3 categories. That those are not pure categories that we use for the analysis. In individualized systems, land rights are held by an individual, and the ownership is marked by land titles and property rights. However, there has been in the literature a link to food insecurity in traditional communities when they get to this level of individualized land tenure systems. On the other side, customary systems, the land rights are held by the community, which is usually represented by traditional leaders such as chiefs and male elders. In customary land tenure systems, it is important to note that the community rights overdo individual rights, which can prevent women from inheriting land or it can dispossess them. And as the name implies, plural or mixed systems are a blend or individualized and customary systems, and usually they shift from customary to individualized systems. Land tenure in customary systems revolves around both access to land and control of land. Access to land includes the right to enter upon and use the land, which are called usufruct rights, and they're linked to your membership in a community. On the other hand, control of land includes the right to make decisions about the land, such as what crops to plant, and the right to transfer land to others, such as through sale or inheritance. In customary systems, control of land is vested in and exercised by those who hold traditional authority, such as chiefs and male elders.
Gina, this
Yes.
is Courtney. I just had a couple comments in the chat to maybe just slow down a little bit if you don't mind. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Although Ghana's legal framework is a plural land tenure system, customary land tenure is a predominant system, particularly in rural Ghana. Thus, approximately 80% of land is held by traditional communities, such as stools, kins, families, or clans, and they are represented by supreme chiefs and councils of elders. Men typically inherit land from their father or petition the chief or male elders for land. And although the existing literature is scant, women farmers in rural Ghana typically have secondary access to and very little control over land. Today, we're going to be drawing on our Soybean Innovation Lab gender impacts work in Ghana's northern region to help contextualize the topics we're covering today. Our goal for the Gender Equity and Land Tenure, or GELT, focus groups was to explore gender equity in customary land tenure among men and women soybean farmers. We developed the GELT Focus Group Guide, which was a peer review by gender specialists at USA, Save the Children, the Catholic Relief Services of Ghana, and MEDA, the Mennonite Economic Development Associates. We conducted Wave 1 of GELT in 2017 during 6 focus groups with separate groups of men and women soybean farmers. And we conducted Wave 2 of the GELT in 2018 during 8 focus groups with separate groups of men and women soybean farmers. We had a total of 183 participants, of whom approximately half were women. Located in West Africa, Ghana had 10 regions at the time our research was conducted, of which the northern Ghana region was the largest, but also the poorest. The focus groups were conducted in villages across 4 districts in the northern region that included Chereponi, Karaga, Saboba, and Tolan districts. In all villages, whose populations were approximately 300 adults per village, soybean is grown by both men and women as a cash crop and a food crop. In the northern region, an estimated of 74% of men and women engage in agricultural production, but primarily as smallholder farmers, And the region highest rates of poverty, food insecurity, and childhood undernutrition in the nation. This includes an estimated poverty rate of 22%, a moderate to severe hunger rate of 31%, and a stunning rate of 39% among children ages 5 and younger. Here is some recent estimates of land ownership rates in Ghana and the northern region. Land ownership by men is estimated at 83% across Ghana and right at 95% in the northern region. Land ownership by women, it's only 10% across Ghana, and it drops by half in the northern region. And joint ownership is also very low at 3.5% across Ghana, and less than 1% in the northern region. For today's webinar, we are going to discuss a number of different factors that we found to impact access to and control of land among our sample of men and women soybean farmers in Ghana's northern region, and how those factors affect men and women differently. These factors are grouped under the heading of culture and traditions, and they include seniority and social status, birthplace connections, marital connections, and marital status. Thank you. In this diagram, we see that culture and traditions are central, and that is because culture and traditions vary across ethnic groups, villages, regions, and countries. For our specific project, we found that seniority and social status, birthplace connections, marital connections, and marital status have important impacts on men's and women's access to and control of land. And exactly how these factors impacted access and control were dictated by culture and traditions. Please keep in mind that these factors were at play in our project, and your projects may likely to have other factors. Now, I am going to turn things over Mawuli to share some of our focus groups results that illustrates this comparison between access and control. Mawuli?
Hello, thank you, Gina. And thank you to all the participants online. At the beginning of each of the GELT focus groups, which were conducted among separate groups of men and women farmers, we specifically defined control of land to our participants as the right to manage your land, which gets at autonomy over your own agricultural decision making, the right to control the income from your land, which gets at autonomy over your own economic decision making, and that these rights cannot be taken from you by anyone for any reason. To begin to understand how our focus group participants gain access to agricultural land, we ask the following question to both men's groups and women's groups. What are the typical ways that men in your village acquire farmland? We found consensus across all focus group discussions that inheritance from father to son was typical, with adult sons acquiring plots from their fathers. Adult sons also take over the land after their fathers retire from farming, and men without land may lease or borrow land to use. As a male farmer from Saboba district explained, your father will know that you are of age to farm, then he will give you a piece of land, and then he will tell you to use this land to farm. Here are some additional responses from both men's and women's focus group discussions. We men acquire our land through inheritance. Since it started, our grandparents and forefathers have passed their land on. When your son is of age and is farming, you, the father, give your land to him to farm, and then you will rest, more or less retire from farming. And often the parent does not have the land. If the parent does not have the land, they can come to the chief to ask for a small portion to give to their son. We also ask, what are the typical ways that women in their villages, in your village, acquire farmland? We found consensus across all focus groups that land is typically not transferred to daughters, although this varied somehow from village to village. Women primarily acquire access to land through their husbands, but typically have little control over that land. And in rare cases, women may inherit lands from their father or a brother. A female farmer in Chereponi district explained that the women go and petition their husband for land to farm. In Saboba district, a female farmer also explained that the husband has to give her land. If he does not have enough, he would have to go to someone to get the land for her to farm. To understand control of land among our focus group participants, we asked the following question. What rights are attached to control of land in your village? Not surprisingly, we found that control of land was quite different for men and women. We found consensus across all focus groups that men have the right to decide what to grow or graze on their land, the right to decide to let their land go fallow, the right to decide on purchasing seed or other agricultural inputs, and the right to engage in land transactions and use their land as collateral. Responses from male farmers in Chereponi clearly lay out the number of rights that men have as a result of having control of land. Men explain that we have the right to lease out the land to someone in the village. We can bequeath the land to someone in the village. We can also lease the land to someone outside the village, and we can sell the land to someone outside the village. We found consensus across all focus groups that women do not have rights over land or control of land, that they cannot decide to let their land go fallow, that they cannot make land transactions or use their land as collateral, but some can decide what to grow or graze on their land. It is important to know that even within a single village, we found variations in responses. For example, some residents of Chereponi district felt that women had full control over their land. We women have the right to farm the land and to let the land go fallow without anybody taking it away. That's by a female farmer in Chereponi district. But other women and men did not agree with that woman's land rights. We did not agree that women's land rights are secured. Someone can take a woman's land whether the woman wants it or not. This was by a female farmer in Chereponi. A woman's plot can be shifted for a comparable piece of land. And this was by a male farmer. This male farmer's response raises the question as to who gets to decide whether a woman's new plot is truly comparable to the plot she was shifted from. Now, I'm going to turn things over to Ashley for our second poll. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks so much, Mawuli. I just want to remind everyone that you can type your questions into the question pane and we'll be collecting those to answer at the end of the webinar. We're going to do our post test as the second poll to analyze what you've learned so far. I've launched the poll. Access to land and control of land mean the same thing. True or false? I will close the poll in 3, 2, 1. Looks like 100% of participants agreed that that answer was false. And just as a reminder, I will be giving you the answers to these questions in the next slide. All right, I'm going to launch the second post-test question. Control over land is the ability to make decisions in regards to the land. I will close the poll in 3, 2, 1. Thanks everyone for submitting your responses. Looks like 94% of responders believe that to be true and 6% believe that to be false. Now on to our last poll question. Control over land includes the ability to transfer land titles. True or false? I will be closing the poll in 3, 2, 1. Thanks everyone for submitting your responses. 92% of poll participants believe the answer to this question to be true and 8% believe it to be false. Let's look at the answers. So, the answers as defined by the SIL Gender Impacts team, access to land and control of land mean the same thing. The correct answer is false. Control over land is the ability to make decisions with regards to the land. True. And the third question, control over land includes the ability to transfer titles, is true. Thanks everyone for participating in our polls today. We love the interactive portion of our webinars, and we hope you do too. Don't forget to type your questions in the question pane. Now I'm going to turn things back over to Mary.
Thank you, Ashley, and thanks everyone for joining us today. As Gina discussed earlier, we identified some key factors that had an important impact on men and women's access to land and control of land. These included seniority and social status, birthplace connections, marital connections, and marital status. And again, it's important to note that exactly how each factor impacts access and control varies from group to group because they are dictated by culture and tradition. So for the next few slides, we'll look at how we frame some of our specific gender equity and land tenure focus group questions to get at these factors. We asked 2 questions to explore how seniority and social status impact access to land. First, when a man becomes a father, describe how he decides to share the farm plots with his son. And then we asked, when a man becomes an elder, describe how his plots are passed on to the next generation. Across all focus groups, we found that men typically access land through inheritance. Senior men tend to exert much control over land, and traditional leaders play a central role in assigning plots. Men are viewed as the custodians of the land, and they represent the entire household when it comes to land transactions. Therefore, they exercise bargaining power for farm plots within and outside of their village. And since women marry into their husband's village, their access to land is determined by marriage connections, not by lineage. And therefore, women have limited ability to change or to expand their plots without buy-in from a senior male. Some responses we got from our questions related to seniority and social status included: we men receive land from our ancestors. We inherit the land from our father. Women do not receive land from a local authority, but their husband will ask the chief for land to give it to her. But the husband will use his name, not hers. And with the transfer of land, you have to see the village elder. You do not give land completely to someone. If you want it back, you can get it back. To learn about birthplace connections, we asked 2 parallel questions. How does a man's birthplace connections impact his access to land after he marries? And how does a woman's birthplace connections impact her access to land after she marries? Across all focus groups, we found that men typically remain in their natal village, their home village. And women typically marry outside their natal village and they move to their husband's village. A woman who may return to her natal village after something like divorce or widowhood may petition her brothers for farmland in some instances. As a female farmer in Saboba district explained to us, if you marry from outside into this village, your home village does not help you have land here. If you go back to your home village, you will have to go to your brothers and ask for land. They will have to permit you to farm on a piece of land, and you cannot pick the land to farm there. And as a male farmer in Karaga district explained, it is the father who will provide the land to the son before he marries. The son needs to be able to farm to make money in order to marry. We also asked two parallel questions related to marital connections. We asked, how does a man's marital connections impact his access to land after marriage? And how does a woman's marital connections impact her access to land after marriage? We found that typically men can access land before getting married, while women are granted access to land by marrying into a community and having children. Yet a woman's access to land is highly dependent on her husband. We found this to be even further complicated in the case of polygamous unions, where a man has more than one wife, which is a common practice in some of the villages where we worked. Here are some responses we got from our questions about marital connections. The woman marries into the clan of the husband and has the right to farmland from her husband. Another participant explained, when the young man gets land from his father and then gets married, he also decides to cut some land for his wife. But if the land that your father gave you is not enough, then the father decides what to do. The father may get more land and give it to the son so he can share it with his wife. Next, we asked a set of questions related to marriage. First, we asked, when a young man marries, describe how he decides to share his farm plots with his wife. Then we asked, and if he takes a second wife, describe how he decides to share his farm plots with each of his wives. After analyzing the data, we found some interesting points related to access to and control of land, including that men typically retain at least 1 acre of land for their own farming purpose. And in several of the focus group villages where we worked, we found that the practice of a man having more than one wife can negatively impact women's land security, as the wives' plots become further divided into smaller plots. In response to our question, when a young man marries, describe how he decides to share his farm plots with his wife, a male farmer explained that if you have 2 acres of land, you give one to your wife to farm, and then you farm the other one. Then we asked, does a man always divide his plots evenly with his wife? And the same man explained, you cannot share equally because you are the head of the house, and whatever you produce, you're going to share with the wife. If the man has 4 acres, he gives 1 to the wife. If he has 2 acres, he gives half an acre to the wife, and he farms on 1.5 acres. If the man has 6 acres, he would give 2 to the wife. So in this one instance, the farmer is saying that the 2 acres of land should be split evenly between the husband and wife. And then in another instance, the same farmer is saying that the man must always keep a majority of the land. And in response to the question, if the man takes a second wife, describe how he decides to share his farm plots with each of his wives. Our participants explained, if a man has 3 acres of land and he marries a second wife, then he gives each wife an acre of land and he gets to keep 1 acre. But if he only has 2 acres of land, then the man will farm 1 acre and he will share the other acres between the 2 wives. Another says, when you pick a second wife, then you go to the first wife and you speak to her. And then you take part of her land and give it to the second wife. So here you see that in order to retain that 1 acre of land for himself, the husband will further divide the first wife's land in order to provide for the second wife. Because we know from the literature that divorce and widowhood can impact women's land security, we asked this question. Let's say that many years have passed and a young woman has grown into an elder and has many grown children, In the event of divorce or death of her husband, what might happen to the land she farms? There was consensus across focus groups that a widow can continue to farm the land her husband provides her, and her son can farm the land when she retires from farming. However, there was not consensus regarding divorce, and the responses were strongly gendered. Women said that they can continue to farm the land after divorce, but men said that in the case of divorce, women will have to leave their land. And for the final portion of today's webinar, I'm going to turn things back over to Kathleen. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, guys. So to close our webinar, we want to look specifically at how gender gaps in land tenure feed into gender gaps in agricultural development. So women and men need both access to and control of land, and our focus group results indicate that customary land tenure impacts access to land for both men and women, albeit differently. However, land tenure insecurity around control of land particularly impacts women. Therefore, economic incentives to invest in their own plots, as their land can be taken away from them if, for example, they improve it too much, is a factor. Their ability to secure loans for agricultural inputs and other economic development activities is also a factor, and their ability to exercise decision-making autonomy about their own agricultural plots. So when we ask our focus group participants what would be some benefits of women farmers having rights to their own plots, there was consensus across focus groups that women would have more agricultural decision-making autonomy, that they would have better control over their crops and their yields, and ultimately, women would be better able to support their families. So as a woman in Chereponi responded, when the land belongs to you, you know that you have rights over that land and that particular plot of land. You always feel confident to know that this particular land belongs to you and no one can take it away from you. And another woman in the same focus group followed up that with that land, you can farm on it and you can take care of your children. And you feel proud that that particular land helped you in upbringing your children and the family. And as a male farmer from Chereponi explained, when the woman has rights over a particular farm, she can do what she wants with the land. She can decide to sell part and then buy livestock and take care of it. She can also farm and sell the produce and then do what she wants with her earnings. And as we know from the literature, what women often do with their earnings is access better food, education, and healthcare for their children. So when it comes to gender gaps in agricultural development, women have less access to extension and technical trainings, as gender norms often dictate that ag extension agents, who are often male, are primarily available for male farmers. Women also have less access to fertile soil. As a respondent has noted, a woman's plot is relatively secure as long as she keeps farming it. But we also know that continuous farming depletes the soil. And this can create a feedback loop for women who have to go through their husbands to access not only land, but inputs such as certified seed and fertilizer, which may not be locally available and are often quite expensive. And in a continuum of the feedback loop, women often have less access to cash income, which impacts their ability to purchase inputs such as certified seed and fertilizer. And these factors can help explain gender gaps in agricultural development, but they're not the complete picture. Women's childcare and household duties create time constraints that compete with their farming duties. Harvesting with children is hard, as one woman said, and threshing is not mechanized in the northern Ghana region and is mostly done by women. And in fact, threshing takes many, many hours of women's time. And these kinds of time constraints can further impact women's access to extension and to technical trainings. So in this photo taken during community mobilization in Ghana's northern region, you can see that the village men are in the foreground in a circle under the tree, and the women are arranged in a broad circle behind them. The extension agent in the blue shirt was helping us with translations. And what quickly caught our attention was that his back was to the women and he was only addressing the men. But once we asked him to please include the women in the conversation, he moved so that he could address everyone in the crowd. And once women knew that they were fully included, they were very willing to speak up and be heard. So CGIAR, the world's largest global agricultural development network, holds that agriculture is underperforming because of women's unequal access to land, fertilizer, technology, extension, and credit. And at the same time, agriculture also faces formidable challenge from increased food demand to climate change impacts. And closing the gender gaps would be good for both men and for agriculture. So before we open up the floor to Q&A, we want to ask you one final question, and we'll share your feedback out to everyone. And that question is, given the diversity of countries and regions with land tenure gender gaps, what learning questions could help us all compare findings across projects and programs? So now I'm going to turn it over to Ashley, who will help moderate your responses.
Thanks for your presentation, Kathleen. We'll now be addressing some questions raised by the attendees. Just a reminder to the panelists, please try to keep your responses brief so we can get to as many questions as possible. Please allow me to introduce Dr. Peter Goldsmith, Director of the Soybean Innovation Lab, who will moderate the Q&A session and direct questions to the panelists. Dr. Goldsmith, please go ahead with the questions.
Thank you, Ashley. What a great webinar. Really a pleasure. We have a significant number of questions. We're not going to get to all of them as we're going to be short on time, but really they're going to promote a lot more discussion. Any questions not answered, we'll be making sure we get you answers from our team offline. One comment I'd like to make before the question was about the importance, the Soybean Innovation Lab understanding this gender issue. And we really thank the gender team for constantly working with the breeders and the agronomists and everyone else, informing us, because the land tenure and the gender issue really underlays economic development and soybean proliferation, and it's such a cross-cutting important theme, and we're so glad to have webinars like this to help us advance the topic. Really critical for any work we do at the Soybean Innovation Lab is first understanding these critical gender issues. So let me get to the questions, and maybe Gina or Mawuli, maybe you guys start off with one of some technical questions. One of them comes from Eric Owusu, and he wanted to know how did you determine the size of focus groups? Just kind of a mechanical question.
Oh, thanks, Peter, and thanks for the question. I think this is a very relevant question because we are drawing conclusions on 4 places that we visited. And usually the size of the focus groups, it has been determined by researchers, but also by how we build into what the theory says. So there is not a rule exactly, but usually you should have focus groups between 8 and 12 people, so you can allow people to really participate and engage. And when you are directing it, you really need to work hard to make sure all the participants are engaged. So if I have to say a rule of thumb, probably between 8 and 12 would be a good number to have in a focus groups.
Yeah, thanks, Gina. Great. And then Indra Klein from the US asked about how many years was the study conducted and how long's been this engagement on this topic in Northern Ghana?
Okay, well, from us, we started specifically to work gender and land tenure in 2008. 2016, starting to thinking about those connections between gender and land tenure, because we initially as a group started to think about gender issues when this project started about 6 years ago. So the thing is that now we added like an additional variable that is the land variable. So I don't know if Kathleen or Mary want to add something else. Apparently no. So Pete, if you have more questions for me or for anybody else.
That's great. Thank you, Gina. And then getting maybe a little bit more into the content. Carlos Zelaya of CRS in Honduras asked about secondary rights and primary and secondary. I wonder if maybe someone on the team could review the difference between the two.
Okay. I'm sorry, I'm gonna keep asking. Hola, Carlos. I'm in Bogota, Colombia. So there is an important probably distinction that maybe show up in the Latin American discussions about land tenure that probably are a little bit different when it comes to Africa. So in this case, the literature would make a suggestions about like the regions. Also, there are some differences. So specifically when we talk about women's rights, that's when we start talking about access to and control of land. And then there are like other, when you start expanding the discussions about how to conceptualize and how to measure land rights, you start to think about these concepts that you mentioned, primary and secondary land rights. And I think it is something that comes a lot when we talk about land rights in Latin America. I can expand more on that like later if we want to keep moving and open the floor to other participants.
Hey, and guys, we couldn't get me unmuted before, and I couldn't jump in earlier. So when the person asked the question about how long the project has been going, so we've been working in northern Ghana since the project started in 2013. Our first rollout of survey research was in 2014. Excuse me. And we've been doing the WEAI or the WEA. And we also did the Soybean Uptake and Network Survey. That is another large survey, and these were done in our control district and in our Soybean Innovation Lab intervention districts. So we've been working in this area for quite a while. And then what we found that in 2016 we started doing focus groups while the enumeration teams were out doing their work. And we found that this was a really good time to get some extra data, so more bang for the buck. So thank you all for that question. And I'm going to take my camera off now.
Hi, guys. I wanted to jump in real quick, going back to that first question about focus groups. Just to throw out, we did a webinar about a year ago all about conducting focus groups. And maybe Courtney and Pete could make that available to the attendees, because, you know, we do talk a lot about focus groups here. And if you want to know more about how to conduct those, that would be a really great resource to use, I think.
Yeah, great, Mary. Yeah, that was a heck of a webinar. Great stuff on that one. So yeah, we can make that available to people. A couple of questions, kind of getting into more of what's going on in the setting in northern Ghana. Dick Tinsley, who's a emeritus professor at Colorado State, asked about kind of the evolution of land tenure. Is there any sort, or do you have a sense of land tenure evolving towards individual, or is it fairly static? You nicely laid out those three forms of land tenure early in the presentation. Are there any dynamics there that you were able to identify?
I'm gonna say something from my knowledge of Ghana, and then I will ask Mawuli to complement my answer. In terms that process of formalization of land rights, there has been in Ghana a project to regularize land tenure, and that attempted to move in some ways from customary tenure systems to individualized rights. However, obviously they encountered that what I have mentioned early in the discussion, that the customs, the culture, and the social structure that exists in rural areas has become not an issue, but an element that is important to consider when you're trying to regularize land tenure. So maybe Mawuli can provide more additional information, if available, on how that has been this governmental attempt to transition from customary to individualized.
Mawuli, did you have anything you wanted to add? Great.
Okay, so thanks very much. Probably not very specific, but just to add that there have been a number of initiatives, especially supporting the customary institution to be able to better manage land. I think there is more, probably a shift towards people now trying to own lands rather than the communal, even though the traditional, customary, and family land and those systems are still well entrenched and still keeping on. But nevertheless, the need for commercial agriculture, people requiring large tracts of land, are changing some of those dynamics, and of course that is also leading to issues around more recent, more often or new conflicts around land. So there's quite some work going on.
Yeah.
Land administration project and all that.
You're breaking up, Mawuli. Darn it.
Oh, sorry about that. So Mawuli's breaking up. I'm sorry for that, because he's such an expert on this stuff. But I do want to mention one more thing. We've have a journal, well, not a journal article. It's actually a report, a technical report from Akua Ritwam and her colleagues at University of Cape Coast, and that's called Gender and Land Tenure in Ghana, a Synthesis of the Literature, and that is from 2014, but we will be glad to share that out with people because it's a very good overview.
Oh, that's great, Kathleen. Thanks. We've got a contextual question, kind of a set of questions. Mary Lucy at University of Missouri asked if you guys could talk a little bit about polygamy, the religious setting of the focus groups, and how household structure and marital structure and religion all fit in with the land tenure issue.
Hi, I can say just a little bit about that, and maybe others can add a bit more, but the majority of our sample and the majority of the villages are Muslim. I think we had one district where they were majority Christian, but among the Muslim villages, polygamous marriage is common practice. And so you'll have the husband taking more than one wife as he collects assets and is able to essentially afford to provide for more than one wife. It's to his advantage to do so. And so that is where you see the polygamy coming in, and that's where the land starts to get divided, as I was explaining. The more wives you have, the more land you have to provide, but at the same time, that division kind of comes out of the other wives. not necessarily that the man will have to sacrifice more of his land. Does anybody else have anything to add related to that? There were kind of other sections to that question, Pete. What?
Just a little something else. When we analyzed the data, we found that somewhat there is a conceptualization of land as an infinite resource. And when the narrative show up, it's like, yeah, I can split this 1 time and 2 times and 3 times. But then when we back to like more concrete questions about the number of acres, then there is like this contrast between, on one hand, saying that the land it's unlimited, but on the other side, just recognize that there are definitely some limits to it. Just to add to what Mary said.
Yeah, I wanted to share that too. That what's interesting, and Gina brought up the good point about this idea that land is vast in the northern region, but it's our understanding that that is not the case in other parts of Ghana. And as land pressure becomes more intense in the northern region, we're going to see a different set of issues will come up. So.
Thanks, guys. I know we're getting close to the top of the hour. I have a great question here from Indra Klein, who asks about, given the extreme disparity of ownership between men and women, do you guys have any thoughts, perceptions on facilitating greater ability for women to own or control land?
Pete, thanks for the reminder about this being close to the top of the hour. This is Ashley. Just wanted to make the announcement that this will be our final question for the day.
I can take that. So one of the things that as researchers in the United States we always come across is the money to do the research, and there's been some very good research out there, and you can look on the AgriLinks has some good sites, and Gina, you can probably recommend some other sites where you can find some good information on projects that have been going. We have not had funding for that particular the gender impacts and land stuff in Ghana. We're doing that kind of as an aside to what we are tasked with, our deliverables for the project, but we are looking for opportunities to move this forward.
Yeah, great. Yeah, so there are lots of great questions. We'll follow up with the ones we didn't get to ask or answer, excuse me. But thanks everyone, and I'll turn it back over to Ashley.
A big thanks to Dr. Goldsmith for moderating our Q&A session today, and also to the panelists for your feedback and your presentations. This concludes the Why Gender and Land Matter in Rural Ghana and the World, the Importance of Closing the Gender Gap in Agricultural Development webinar. Thank you all so much for your participation. If we did not get the chance to address your question, we will be communicating with you after the webinar to provide a written response. Today's webinar has been recorded, and a link to the recording will be sent to you in a follow-up email, along with a link to the handouts and presentation slides. Once the webinar has ended, a survey will pop up. We'd really appreciate it if you could take a minute to fill it out. We rely heavily on your feedback to guide us on how to continue to bring you exciting and useful webinars. Thank you so much for your interest in today's webinar, and have a great rest of your day. Bye.
Thank you.